pass you over to Lydia, who is the Queen of EHCPs and everything surrounding that. And we're delighted to welcome her back again. As I say, this is the second of the series of six. And so I will pass you over to Lydia.
Oh, thank you, Sally. So I'm Lydia Dunford Anderson. I'm a solicitor at Boys Turner. Um, First off, please do say if you can't hear or see me. I'm assuming it's okay, but please let me know if you can't. Um, our education team, we advise parents of children and young people who have special educational needs through the EHCP process from beginning to end at various stages. And yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about the very beginning of that process, which is the Education, Health and Care Needs Assessments, or EHC needs assessments. So these are some kind of key sort of questions, points that I'm going to cover. It will be fairly brief just because of time, but hopefully it will give you, an insight, a starting point about the process. And I will address questions as they're kind of put to me. Certainly do my best I can with them. But yes, we're going to cover from what an EHC needs assessment is, who can request one, information and advice that is part of that process, options if an assessment is not agreed, and timelines and kind of information to be aware of as well.
So, Lydia, what is an EHCNA?
So yes, there are lots of ways that you can refer to this. So you have Education, Health and Care Needs Assessment, which I think is a bit of a mouthful. EHC Needs Assessment, EHCNA. They're all one of the same thing, but it's a holistic assessment of a child or young person's education, health and care needs, as in the title, carried out by the local authority where that child or young person lives, so their home local authority. And it's the start of the EHCP process. And I'm assuming that probably a fair few of you are familiar with the process just in general or going through it at some stage. This starts that off. It's a process where it's collating information from various professionals to inform the education, health and care needs of that particular individual. And you're aiming through that information to confirm the scope of needs of that child or young person. So whether they may have special educational needs, and I'll come on to that, and the provision required to meet those needs. So whether they may need an EHCP to secure that provision or not. Very broadly, that's what it is. And yeah, it starts off the EHCP process as well.
And who can request an EHCNA?
So a few different people. The most common one that I come across is the child's parents will request this directly to the local authority, but if it's a young person, so that's someone over 16, and that can be someone up to the age of potentially 25 as well, if they have capacity to bring that request, and there's a presumption that the young person would have capacity. Oh, someone's mic's not muted, so I just picked up a bit of noise then. I'm not sure who it is.
There we go, whoever it is, I've just muted you.
So yeah, there's a presumption that a young person would have capacity unless it's proven otherwise. So either parent, young person, the placement So school, college, they can push a request in as well to the local authority. You can also have a range of other professionals, people who could put a request forward. So ones who are involved with that individual, so foster carers, health, social care, someone in early years. It generally, from my experience, it's normally the kind of parents or the placement submits the request. So they're all valid ways to do it. But I will come on to when the options if a request is not agreed to, it's then very specific about who could challenge that and who has those options at that point as well. But there's potentially lots of people who could put a request in.
So Lydia, the question's just come in, which is very relevant. So
Yeah.
what happens if the child does not have any professional involved? So does the LEA have the responsibility to have that, to do that on their behalf? Makes sense.
So someone else could bring the request. So
Yeah.
it could be that the parent or the placement might want to bring that request, or the young
OT.
person. Yeah, potentially. I think if you I don't see any reason why not. Well, they can if they said, well, we are involved
Right.
and we feel that this holistic assessment is needed. But yes, for something like that, it would be worth seeking out specific advice just to kind of get that guidance on how to approach it.
Yeah, that sounds right, because I think sometimes it's sort of frowned upon, which is another one of the answer if the parent replies as the document is regarding education. Sorry, so it's a little bit related, so I think that's a bit of a grey area actually for some people maybe.
Right.
But
Yeah, it's worth getting, I'd say, get specific kind of advice on that, because then
yeah,
you can start off the process hopefully having that information about how to address it.
right. Thanks.
And what information and advice must the local authority gather during an EHCNA?
So this is on the basis that a local authority has agreed to carry out an assessment. So if they've received a request from one of the options on the previous slide, and something that is probably worth sort of going over now anyway is to just clarify what the local authority has to be satisfied in terms of agreeing to do the assessment. So it's basically whether the child or young person may have special needs, not necessarily that they have a formal diagnosis or anything, but that they may have special needs and that they may require provision to meet those needs, and that may need an EHC plan. So there are other factors, considerations to go into that request. Again, each potentially each case is different, and depending on what age you're making this request, the situation for the child or young person at the placement, whether they're in a placement or not. But that's essentially what you're saying, is that they may need this, they may have said they may need this provision through an EHCP. I will say later I will cover the options if they don't agree, but if assuming that they do and that they've considered the information provided, they've looked at the relevant legal tests and gone, yeah, we're satisfied. They then have set information that they have to do for that holistic assessment. And this is very clear in the SEND regulations. And quite often, this is where the issues can start to happen. You'll see it's quite a long list of people who are required to contribute to this holistic assessment. Parents, young person, I mean, that's fairly obvious. Placement, again, quite often, if one or either of these options has already put the request in, their views have already been sort of collated, but again, they need to be reached out to. Medical, so that's looking at pediatrician, GP, Educational psychologist is the EP, and this is the one where often the the crux of the decision sort of rests. Um, so this is someone who it's a local authority, educational psychologist, and it is also important to note that that doesn't mean it has to be someone from the local authority. And something that seems to be happening a lot at the moment is delays on this advice being gathered. And that's for various reasons. Often it's a shortage of educational psychologists to begin with, or they're on a kind of like a tiered system. So they're assessing, but they can only they're going through certain criteria through the LA to then kind of keep up with the sort of demand. Um, so that is one thing which we are finding at the moment is causing delays. That is the advice from an educational psychologist. And there are options to address that, such as seeking advice from an independent expert for the local authority and putting it to them to say, well, use them instead. But again, that's kind of going on to a sort of a separate issue in terms of just delays in the process overall. But that's often quite key because it's an educational psychologist who will be looking at, in theory, they would be seeing the child or young person in the setting and collating, reviewing the information from the school, from parents, the other advice provided, and making those recommendations about the scope of need, the scope of provision required, and whether that may need an EHCP. And that's looking at whether the provision goes beyond what a maintained mainstream setting could reasonably provide through their resources. So that's the sort of threshold they're looking at. Social care is one quite often when the kind of response will be the child or young person's not known to social care. That's not the same thing as seeking advice from that body, because there may be needs that haven't been identified. It may be that they need support outside of the home in the community. But quite often that one, there's not normally much that comes back on that. You then also have advice on preparing for adulthood, independent living if you're post year 9. And the next one is the one that often is used quite a lot. So advice that's reasonably requested from the parents or young person. So that might be other therapists like speech language, occupational therapy, physio, whoever's, depending on the individual needs, someone might already be involved. It really does depend, and it's ultimately on the local authority about sort of, I suppose, with their judgment as to if that's reasonable to seek that advice from that particular professional for that particular child or young person. So that's quite often something that gets used, and then advice around hearing or visual impairment as well, if that's the case. So potentially quite a lot of people involved who have set timescales to respond to this. And the timescales from memory I've got towards the end of the slides. But that goes back to the fact that there are delays at the moment across local authorities with educational psychologists in particular, and lack of resources unfortunately doesn't fall under one of the few exceptions to the timings. So those sort of exceptions are looking at things like if you're out of the borough for 4 weeks, or kind of like unforeseen circumstances sort of thing. There's nothing that's covered to say there is a shortage of the expert in question. So sometimes you do have to kind of work around that a bit, and if you can propose another, an option who might be available.
Rebecca says that their school is not obliged to acknowledge private reports.
Right, and I'm not sure in what sense they mean acknowledge it. I mean, So I mean, certainly if a local authority says they won't accept private reports, then that to me is looking like a blanket policy, which we'd be saying, well, that seems unlawful because that there's nothing to say that you can't accept advice from an independent expert. Um, schools, again, I'm not quite sure what the context is, why they say they can't,
I'm
you
not
know.
obliged, don't know.
No, I'm not sure. So it might be worth reaching out.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. Again, ultimately, this is all going to the local authority for this decision. It's the school will be approached for advice for this, and they may have made the request themselves, but the decision's with the local authority about whether this assessment takes place first, and then the outcome of that. So yeah, just worth bearing that in mind.
Who gives advice for the independent living? Does that again come from local authority?
I mean, that's a good question. Without going back to check over what the specific wording says, I would expect that to be someone through the local authority. Um, Again, it also might depend if you have someone who's already involved with the young person to support them in that or working with them, then it would make sense to say, well, seek their advice if they already know them. But I can double check if there's any more specific wording about who that would be. But generally, I would expect it to be someone under the local authority's umbrella who can provide that expertise. But yeah, I can always check that up.
Right. It could be, so Rebecca is speaking, thanks Rebecca, about her particular school. It could be, Rebecca, that Lydia will see all of these questions, and it's possible that she'll have an answer for most of these questions at the end. Is that okay, Lydia? There's quite a
Yeah.
lot coming in. Okay, great.
So we've been talking a bit about, we've been edging on the timelines. So what are the timelines involved?
So broadly, it's 20 weeks from week one is you request the EHC needs assessment, you, placement, whoever is doing it. The local authority then have 6 weeks from the date that they receive that request. So I'm assuming if the request goes in by email, there's this, I would say the assumption that they receive it that same day. So that's when your 6 weeks starts. Obviously, if you send it by post, that's going to delay it. So by week 6 of the LA receiving that request, they have to decide whether they will carry out the assessment or not. If they don't, I will talk about what the options are. If they do, then we start from week 6 out of the 20. That's when the local authority has to start the holistic assessment, contact the professionals who we had on the previous slide, and they have to then reach out. That information has to be provided. It's either 4 or 6 weeks. I have to remind myself of that request from the LA. So fairly quick, and that's where there seems to be issues with educational psychologists meeting that deadline to get the information back to the local authority, because then the local authority has to collate all that information, and you're looking at by about week 16. So in theory, 10 weeks from when they've decided they will assess, that's when the local authority should be saying, we've reviewed all the information, we will issue an EHCP, that's the next stage, or we won't. So if they did issue an EHCP, you would then, in theory, have a final plan by week 20. So that's your week 1 to week 20. Throughout that, there are up to 3 points when the local authority could go against what you've asked for. So they could say no to the assessment to start with. They could say yes to assess, but they won't issue an EHCP. So that's by about week 16. Or you get to week 20, you have a final EHCP, and then you don't agree with the content. So you've potentially got 3 stages when actually it's challenged. So that 20 weeks could go on a lot longer. But for our purpose, it's that initial week 1 plus. The good chunk of it is the assessment process, really, and getting that advice and information. And those timescales are set. As I was talking about, there are limited exceptions to not meet those. So it's worth diarising when the request goes in, when a decision is due, that sort of thing, just to kind of keep tabs on it.
But yeah, at that 16-week point, if they say no, can parents appeal immediately? I mean,
So yeah, so if they say no to issuing an EHCP, if we're
right.
assuming they've done the assessment, yes, you have a right of appeal at that point. Um, it's yeah, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think there's a previous slide, Sally, about the options to challenge. Oh, and I should also say on that, the one with the timeline, there's a link.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Uh, there was a link to which you can access through the slides to a sort of fact sheet as well
Okay.
about
Right.
this, just for reference. Yes, this was the other slide.
I'm sorry, I must have skipped over
Oh,
that
that's
one.
okay. It kind of worked, but it's okay.
So what options are there if the NA does not agree to carry out any HCP? So Janet obviously already knew she was psychic and could read the missing slide.
Yeah, this is the one where um, you often do have to sort of act on, unfortunately, or potentially up to 3 times. So again, this is if we're saying that you've put a request in, and with it after the 6 weeks, the local authority has said either we're satisfied that the child or young person has special needs, or they may do, but we're not satisfied based on what you submitted that those needs may require provision through an EHCP, then you do have options to formally challenge. There should be a formal decision letter. Reasons should be given in that letter to say why they've not agreed to do the assessment. And it should be focusing on the legal tests rather than, there's a delay, we can't do this, we can't assess because there's a delay in availability of experts or something. I can't think I've come across that example, but it needs to be the correct legal test, and that's something which often doesn't always happen. Actually, if you get that decision, but it seems that they've either kind of missed or not considered something that's been submitted, or something which clearly is addressing the level of need, the level of provision, or they sometimes they jump ahead, I've found, and they'll start talking about that an EHCP is definitely needed, whereas at the assessment request stage it's only that it may be. So that's what you want to be checking, that they're not saying, well, they definitely have to have an EHCP or not, because that's sort of preemptive. There is a weird bit in the legislation where the wording is slightly off on that. It at one point it takes out the reference to the word may, which I think is very unhelpful. It has it, and then it goes, oh, if it's not required. I go, it's not.
Mm.
I don't know. Yeah, it's very odd why that's happened, but again, the question is whether an EHCP has to be in place. That is, you decide that once you've carried out this assessment, because then you have all this information to make that decision. That's my understanding of it. So if they say no, you do have options. One option is you could write to the local authority to say, well, you've issued this decision not to do the assessment. We think this has not addressed the correct legal tests, or you've not addressed all the evidence that was submitted. We'd like you to reconsider. And sometimes that will do it. Again, each case is different and it depends, but sometimes they will go, okay, yeah, no, we see your point. There is obviously a risk that they could say, well, no, we've issued our decision, you can appeal it if that's your formal right to challenge it. And that is technically true. The difficulty at the moment with, and I imagine this will probably come up in most most of the webinars, is the fact that tribunals at the moment are taking very, very long from registering up to a hearing. So, hearings are kind of 12, 13, 14 months from when they're registered, which is, that's such a long amount of time. So if you're starting off at the beginning and you've got a decision which has not addressed the right legal tests, and you go, you've then got potentially 14 months to kind of challenge this and not get a decision. Sometimes it is worth doing the write to them first to see if they'll reconsider and a sort of appeal and just say, look, we're not going to do an appeal for this, surely, because that this, the LA wouldn't have anything to back it up because they'd say, well, yeah, you've not actually applied the right legal test. So potentially that can be an option. And that might help, and they might say, yeah, we'll assess. You then also have backup options of mediation. So ahead of going for an appeal, you have to at least consider mediation. And in some cases, it's a useful option, particularly if there's something new that hadn't previously been considered, or it just feels like actually, I think, the LA might be on board to listen and to work. So maybe sometimes that's an option. Your ultimate option is to appeal to the Send Tribunal, who are independent from local authorities, and they oversee all the appeals in terms of EHCP's assessments, all the stages. There's lots of different types of appeals they can hear. So those are your options. It obviously doesn't preclude you from working with the local authority, even if you lodge an appeal to try and get them to agree. And for these stages of appeals, I remember I think the percentage is something very, very high. It's like sort of, don't quote me, but it's something like 95.7% in parents' favour for these appeals, because the threshold is in theory low legally to say what has to be satisfied. And these are also the types of appeals where the tribunal often pushes for them to be heard on the papers. So they wouldn't have witnesses attending, it wouldn't be usually remote. They would say, well, we'll just read the bundle of papers and we'll decide based on what parents have submitted, what the LA has submitted, and then we decide. So potentially in those options, you may get a shorter timetable as well, because again, it's such a specific point. And in theory, it's a simpler appeal for the tribunal to kind of process and decide on. But again, it's sometimes you don't really know. I think it might depend on the tribunal's capacity at that time, and it always seems to be there even less capacity every time you sort of go to them. So there are options. It's worth getting sort of support or advice if you've got a decision that says no and you're not sure what to do with it, because there may be that actually writing to the LA might be a good thing to do. It might be that there's no point doing that because actually they've applied it and their decision is, actually sound, and that there wasn't evidence to support what was being asked or whatever it might be. So it's worth just considering options at that point and seeking advice if you're not sure, ahead of going into these. And it's also bearing in mind that there are set deadlines if you want to appeal. It's initially 2 months from the date of your decision letter. That 2 months is your cutoff to have contacted mediation, either to go to mediation or just to consider it. You then get a mediation certificate, either after mediation or if you don't want to do mediation. And then your final deadline is whichever is the later date of the 2 months from the letter or 1 month from the certificate. So it's a bit, you have to sometimes think a bit tactically and work backwards and go, right, when is the latest I could, but it's bearing those things in mind as well about not losing that right of appeal. Is mediation worth doing? And also you can go to mediation and still appeal as well. It doesn't stop you from appealing if mediation doesn't resolve it as well. It's worth remembering that.
So we've already obviously discussed the timelines, and that's where the link is, which will be available on the slides.
Yeah, something actually it's worth adding to here is obviously if you the timelines almost they kind of get put to one side if you go into an appeal. So if you get to week 6 and your LA decision is they won't assess, you're then going into a potential tribunal appeal, which is months and months, So the actual the EHC timelines are sort of put on hold, and then you sort of come back into it again once you've gone through the appeal. So then it's if they will assess, you go, right, we're now technically at week 6 again, and then we're starting from week 6, but this is however many months, since if you've gone through an appeal. So it's bearing that in mind as well, that you have to then sort of line it back up again. And then the timelines again are on the local authority to be completing the assessment process, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I'm going to go back to a couple of points, and there's a couple of questions there, Lydia. It was going back to Rebecca, who was talking about her school not feeling that they're obliged to take in the private report. So the school won't take the advice in the report on board. And, she needs the school to contribute to the process. I mean, where do you go? What do you do with that?
So, I mean, broadly, schools, if there's no EHCP in place, which if we're talking about starting an EHC needs assessment, then assuming that there's no EHCP, beforehand, and it's not a reassessment of needs, schools need to use best endeavours to, support pupils who have special educational needs and disabilities, reasonable adjustments. So they have those sort of requirements on them as standard. Whether they specifically want to adopt a private report, I mean, without knowing the school's reasoning, that would impact on how you would just approach that and say, well, why? Is it to do with funding? Is it because the recommendations from that report require a higher level of funding for the provision that the school hasn't got? It's again also remembering that the school will be providing, I'm taking out, not including independent settings, because if it's an independent school, essentially they can kind of say, well, this is what we provide, through our fees, etc. And that's that. If it's, kind of like a maintained setting, you're then looking at, well, what can they provide through their resources? Is it sufficient? And actually, if they're saying, well, we can't do this extra amount because of funding resources, then that's adding weight to say, well, we need the actual assessment done. We need this EHC process to start, because there's the argument that the provision needs that EHCP to secure it because the school can't provide it, or whatever the reason is. And again, remembering that the ultimate decision is on the local authority about the assessment, not the school. So even if school is saying, well, we can't implement this private report, it's, that report, that may well still be helpful to request an assessment anyway from the local authority to say, well, we have this information. That's something I didn't actually go over, is the fact that there is a caveat to say that if you have advice already provided and it's agreed that can be used for the assessment process, for the EHC process, then there's no need to duplicate that. So say if you're going into it saying, we've already got advice from an educational psychologist and it's done very recently, we would like you to use this LA. Then you can put the argument to say you don't need to duplicate that and get your own advice, because we've already done part of the work for you, essentially. So again, each case is different. That might not be an option. It might be one where local authorities say, well, we'll consider it, but actually we're not going to rely on it for this purpose. We're going to get our own. But it's just worth bearing that in mind as well, that sometimes that can be quite useful.
Thank you, Lydia. And thanks, Faye, for this one. I submitted a private SALT report, and LA did not include anything from this, but they only included the NHS SALT report from a one-off assessment. Isn't that interesting?
I mean, again, yeah, there's two things for that. One is if the private report was the only one there, then you'd want to say to the LA, well, why are you not accepting it? If it's private, then that is very much looking like a blanket policy again, which you'd be going, that's absolutely, can't do that. If it's just that they have their evidence and you have yours and they've preferred their own, they can do that, even if you read it and go, well, clearly, or it seems to be that one's been chosen, the NHS one, because the recommendations are lower or less specific or not as tight. Um, they can rely on their own, even if you go, well, clearly this doesn't really reflect actually what is needed. If it was a
Yeah.
one-off, or sometimes it's an observation, sometimes it's just there's been very minimal interaction with the child or the young person. But they are still entitled to make the recommendations. Um, you then are potentially, for the reasons why they've said it, you're then potentially looking at challenging it through an appeal. And then it's about the strength of what your expert says versus theirs and going, well, why is theirs insufficient to meet need? And why should
Mhm.
yours be preferred? Um, what's missing from the NHS one? Sometimes that is how it goes, unfortunately. But again, it depends on the reasons why they've not gone with the independent one.
Thank you. There are quite a few here, so guys, please bear with us. I'm aware of our time, but we're gonna. If Sally, you can put your hand up as to when we have to stop, but we'll try and get through them because they're wonderful. And if you're still with us, Lydia, that would be even better, obviously. Thank you, Nicola. This in some areas, EPs, they're. Oh, sorry. Please bear with me. I've gone and missed a line. They are taking, gosh, so in some areas it's taking 12 to 18 months for EPs to undertake their assessments. This is resulting in some CYP being out of education
Mm.
or in a setting that is unable to meet need.
Yeah.
What is the legal position with these delays?
So
Gosh,
again, yeah, that's really
gosh.
awful. So again, yeah, there are limited exceptions why the assessment process can be delayed, and lack of experts resources is doesn't fall under any of those. Um, so we do come across this. So there are potential options to formally query it with the local authority. So whether it's a formal letter to say, there's this timeline, here is where it says the timeline, this is not being met, it's not under one of the legal exceptions, you have to remedy this and expedite it. I mean, there's things like formal complaints to local authorities through their process. Is then bearing in mind the timescales that those can take. You then potentially have the option for judicial review, or to at least threaten judicial review to say that there is this deadline, it's not being met, you have to remedy this. I would stress with any of those to seek advice, because there are very strict requirements, certainly for judicial review, about timings, when you can do that, what you're actually challenging, and the legal kind of tests and references. So it's worth seeking advice, because there are the options to push back. Lack of resources is not one of them. Is it a case that of asking the LA to seek an independent expert and say, well, rather than rely on yours, seek one, or can you propose one to say, look, we've actually got someone who we know of or we've used before or is currently working with the child or young person sometimes, to say, can you use them? But again, it's worth seeking advice on it. If they're out of school, if they're of compulsory school age, then they need to be receiving something suitable and for their needs, and that's as full time as possible. It can't be that they're just left because of this delay. So that's on the LA to be providing that outside of the assessment delay as well.
Does that letter, is it the parents that have to start that? If it's taking this long, are they the ones? Or I guess they've gone and got legal advice.
So
Well,
if it's through legal advice, then that is one way to do it. I mean, it's worth, even if you, I would just stress, yeah, to get the advice, because like I say, it's very specific about what needs to be challenged and what the timings are and that sort of thing. But you know, the option is always there for parents to go to the local authority directly and say, we are aware that this is well over time and you need to remedy this. Otherwise, we will look to, you know, kind of sort of escalate this. But it's just being aware of the options about escalating it and being aware of what that might be involved, timings, the requirements, that sort of thing. It is unfortunately something that we're experiencing a lot. And I'm not sure that there's a sort of obvious solution to it. It's just from our point of view, it's going back to what the law says, and the law currently says this, it has to happen within this time frame. That's it. Yeah.
This is more of a comment, really, and I think it's also from Nicola. She's a private OT and has worked with the same LEA for the past 8 years. And sometimes they say they will not accept her report because it's private, and sometimes they will instruct me and pay me to complete an assessment. Sometimes they make the parents pay also.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a lot, actually. Right. Okay. Sorry, that's sort of more of an input.
That's interesting.
Gosh.
Yeah, that's tricky. That must be very frustrating actually to be in that situation. Yeah, but again, the kind of the blanket policy thing around not accepting private reports is, you know, is rubbish. And should be pushed back on. Yeah.
Gosh, right. There's a lot here. I'll read this one out for you, Lydia. And please bear with me, guys. So when the EP did an assessment, their recommendation was for the child to attend a specialist provision, but then also said if they went mainstream, what they would need. So the LA went against EP recommendation and decided mainstream. Said we was going to tribunal and they changed their mind. Also, can we challenge, please bear with me, challenge something in my way. Please, can we challenge EP reports as the child's was poorly written and did not outline the child's needs? Yeah, and was more just sort of observations.
Yeah, that's tricky. So again, reports provided for the assessment process should be, if I recall, should be specific and I think yeah, it's at least specific, but there is wordings that addresses that, but they should be clear, specific, set out the needs provisions, outcomes as well to be met by the provision. So yes, if a report doesn't meet that standard, then yes, in theory, you could say, well, actually, this doesn't meet the level of detail that it should be, especially you know, if there's not been any direct work with the child or young person, maybe that wasn't possible. Sometimes that's the case, and it's just not possible to do that. Or, you know, but again, it's making that clear to say that that's what's happened for context. I suppose if the local authority EP gave the options for both the unit and mainstream, then I suppose the local authority is technically not going against that. If their expert has said, well, they could have this or they could be here with this support, I guess the LA's gone, well, okay, that's useful. We'll go with the mainstream option with additional support or whatever it is. Yeah, it is an odd one. I mean, ultimately, it's really about what impact that has, and if the outcome of that means actually the provision is not right or the setting's not right, you're then saying, right, do we need to appeal because it's not going to quite cut it. But yeah, that's an interesting one. And I suppose it's bearing in mind as well that there is potentially more of a push towards mainstream places.
Really? Okay.
And yeah, and just potentially even ones with units, but just a bit more potentially of a push for that. So I suppose it's just bearing that in mind that that might be why potentially you're looking at those sorts of options from the expert reports, the local authority reports. They may be saying, right, this can be done with this additional support in place or with these adjustments or that sort of thing to try and support that kind of inclusivity side of things. And the fact that parents of children with special needs, they have a right to say, well, we want them to be in mainstream, and mainstreams technically, really have to go, okay, yes, we can do that. And it's very, very hard for them to say we can't,
Right.
make the kind of adjustments and take these reasonable steps to take away any incompatibility of the other pupils. It's very hard to sort of say, well, we can't do anything to meet this need.
Okay. I think, can I ask you one more? And guys, Lydia will have access to this, won't you, Lydia? Because there's some that probably require a longer answer. Just bear with me. I did have one more. I wanted to see if we could fit in. Sorry, guys. There's so many now. I can't keep up with you all. Just bear with me. I've got it coming here now. From Georgia. Right, so Georgia, what can be done if the LA have agreed to an EHCP? It's past the 20-week deadline, but they do not send the EHCP to the school or parents. This has been chased for months, and they will not release the EHCP documents despite it having been agreed.
That's really weird. If it's finalized, then yes, it should be absolutely issued to the name setting and to you as parents. I don't know why they wouldn't do that. That's bizarre.
So it's been chased for months. They will not release it. That'd be funny.
That's really odd. I have no idea why they would do that. Because they are also if you've not had sight of that and the decision letter, then that is impacting on your ability to potentially appeal that because you don't have the information that you would need, i.e. the letter and the EHCP, if you needed to appeal. Yes, that would, I mean, there's multiple things you could risk, say, a formal complaint, but that potentially probably would take too long. Sometimes a sort of sternly worded letter to whether it's the head of SEN, head of legal, both, just to say what's going on. I'm saying this without knowing all the details and the context, but just in theory, if there's the decision that's not been shared with you, then yes, it may be flagging it up to the head of that level to say you need to action this now, otherwise we'll be looking at other options. Because even things like, sort of disclosure requests that can take too long. Yeah, I've no idea why they would do that. That's bizarre. But if in doubt, seek advice, even if it's just about how to approach them. And does it need to be something formal from a solicitor? Does it need to be something else? Does it? Yeah, I'm not sure why they would do that. That's bizarre.
I ask one more.
Yeah, go on.
We've got time for one more, yeah.
One more. Sorry, guys. Does the local authority have to give equal weighting to parents, the young person's contributions, wishes in the EHCNA, or is the outcome and what's offered very much based on the professional's input in reality?
So they absolutely have to take into account parents and young person, child's views. They need to have regard to those, absolutely. General kind of thought is that the older a child gets, then the kind of more weight you apply to those views as they get older. But again, also if you've got parents' views, yes, they should be considering those absolutely. The actual decision, I mean, in terms of the provision, it's likely going to come down from what the experts say. I think because they are, that's their professional remit and that's what they're recommending. I think quite often the question about views and how much weight's placed on it is when you're looking at placement. So that's not something. So for the EHC assessment stage, placement, that doesn't really come into it until a plan is agreed to and being prepared. But it's when you're looking at preference for placement, again, there's a certain amount of weight to be applied to that. And there are legal requirements that the LA has to consider about naming a placement that follows what parents want or the young person wants it to be. But again, there are exceptions to those, and they will be looking at the expert advice as well, ultimately, and what the schools say at that point as well. Yeah, I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but yeah, they absolutely should give weight to them, definitely.
Super. Good. Well, thank you so much for that, Lydia. That was all very interesting. These are the 4 remaining webinars that we'll be doing over the next 4 months. And we can send links to all of those so you can sign up and get your spots from those. And we'll also send the slides, which will have that link in as well that Lydia put in. So thank you very much, Lydia. That was another very interesting one, and I always find it very it's always so difficult to hear that parents have to take on so much. You've basically got to learn everything, and then when you do it, then you've got all of these delays, and then you've got to try and understand what you can do. But it's the usual kind of story of parents having to fight every inch of the way to get the best support for their children. So yeah, it's very difficult. Well, obviously, we're very grateful for you to help and share your information with people. And thank you very much for everybody for joining, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you, Janet, for reading out all of those questions so well. There will be questions there that haven't been addressed, so they will all go to Lydia, and then she will then reply to you directly as she can. And yeah, so thank you all very much, and we hope to see you at some future webinars.
Yeah, please do come back. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.